Hello, welcome to Roy's Book Reviews. I am Roy, and I am early on in my career here as a booktuber, a field that just recently entered, putting my words, my thoughts on novels for the most part, books that I've read over the years and have reviewed in written form on Amazon or largely at goodreads.com. I decided to discuss them here on video for anyone who prefers to get their book commentary in the video format. So today I'm going to discuss the novel 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Stephen King is one of our finest authors, a writer who I have been familiar with from early on in my reading days. When I was young, I actually attempted to read every single Stephen King book, and for a while it looked like I was going to be able to do so, but ultimately he wrote at a faster pace than I was able to read at, primarily because I wanted to read diversely and read other authors as well. And it seemed for every other book that I read, Stephen King would manage to put out two or three new titles. So eventually I decided to give up my quest, and I still come back to Stephen King time and time again. And perhaps at some point I will make it all the way through his catalog. For now, I still have quite a few books to go. But I'm happy that I stumbled upon 11/22/63 and gave it a read. It's very interesting, and it's a bit of a departure for Stephen King in that even though it kind of falls into the horror genre and that it is about a creepy killer that someone is trying to prevent from acting out on a foretold murder. This story doesn't really have supernatural element. It is not about someone who is possessed by some sort of demon or isn't human. The monster in this story is a human being one whom we all know, and you will find out who I am talking about in a little bit if you do not already know from the title 11/22/63, which refers to a date in American history when a very tragic event took place. Stephen King has so many great books under his belt that I wonder that if he was instead a one-hit wonder and got to choose which of his best-selling novels was to be his literary legacy, which book would he choose? I feel he would be wise to give strong consideration to 11/22/63 because it is one of his finest stories. The main character in this novel is a man named Jake, to whom a time travel portal is shown by a friend of his. Unlike a time machine that could bring someone wherever they chose to go in either the past or future, Jake is able to leave his time behind and enter a particular day in a particular year, that year being 1958. His friend, who owns a burger joint in the town they live in, uses the portal quite a few times, and he has a particular mission in mind, which he ultimately is unable to fulfill, in large part because he ends up getting cancer and his days are limited, and he knows he is not going to have the energy and strength required to go back one more time and finish what he set out to do. So he passes this task on to his friend Jake. Jake is quite reluctant at first, Ultimately, he is convinced to do it when he gives the portal a test run, finds out that it does indeed take him back to the year 1958. He knows that a terrible event took place in 1958 because in the present, he has a friend who is a janitor at the school where Jake teaches. And back in 1958, the janitor's father went crazy on the family. He ended up killing the mother and siblings of this kid and left him mentally challenged for the rest of his life. Jake wonders if he goes back and stops this massacre from taking place. When he comes back to the present, how different would his friend's life be? So he does that, and he finds that he did make a significant change in his friend's life by preventing the killing. So he's like, okay, if that works, then I can go back and stop the killing that his friend wants to stop, one that's quite famous. It is the assassination of John F. Kennedy by Lee Harvey Oswald. So Jake is talked into going back 50 plus years so he could change the fate of some ordinary people and also change history book level history. Since JFK is not killed until 1963, Jake must stay in the past for several years in order to confirm beyond doubt that Oswald acted alone. And once that's accomplished, to stop Oswald by any means necessary. The most effective means, of course, is to kill Oswald before he becomes an infamous killer. He is unwilling to do this in 1958 because at that point, Lee Harvey Oswald had not made the decision to kill Kennedy yet, and there still is the possibility that maybe Oswald did not act alone. Maybe he acted as a puppet on behalf of Russia or Cuba or the mafia, or who knows. There are many conspiracy theories about the assassination of JFK. So Jake needs to hang around long enough to study up on Oswald and determine for certain what his motivation was and who was and was not behind the act. In the process of waiting for his opportunity to save Kennedy, Jake ends up meeting a woman who becomes the great love of his life. He does not meet such a woman in his current lifetime, but when he goes back into the past, he ends up meeting a woman he wants to spend the rest of his days is. The issue with that, of course, is he would be starting the rest of his days before he is even originally born. So he has a conundrum. Do I want to live in this time and be with this woman, or do I want to return to the life that I once had? So I am reading from my review written at Goodreads, where I wrote, as King's hefty book heads towards Jake's date with destiny, we root for him to achieve his objective and to get the girl. It takes a while for him to dismiss all conspiracy theories and conclude that Oswald did indeed act on his own. Loving Sadie, on the other hand, comes easily. I'm going to keep this review spoiler-free. In reality, of course, we know that Lee Harvey Oswald does succeed. He does assassinate President Kennedy. So this book that Stephen King writes, he's basically giving us an examination of the butterfly effect, in that if Jake is able to succeed, what is the ripple effect going to be? Kennedy is able to finish out his presidency, maybe, completes 2 terms. Does that mean that the Vietnam War does not take place, or is much shorter? If that happens, how many lives are saved? How different is the landscape of America and of the world, um, if Kennedy lives? So we're pulling for Jake to change the world, but we know that in reality, the world we live in is the one in which there is no Jake, and there is no saving of Kennedy, and there is a Vietnam War. And so it's a very interesting um, scenario that King puts before us. And I'm not going to tell you how he ends up pulling it off, except to say that it is quite fascinating. There are quite a few great Stephen King novels, and this exhaustively researched one deserves a spot among the best of his best, in my opinion. I tend to read at a leisurely pace, and this book comes in at over 1,000 pages. So, ordinarily, a book that size would take me quite amount of time to finish it. Um, but by my standards, I raced through this book because I really wanted to know what was going to happen, even though I already knew what is destined to happen in reality. But what was Stephen King's take on it going to be? Um, Now that I'm done reading this book, I kind of miss being immersed in this half real, half imagined world that Stephen King created. I do highly recommend it to all readers, to Stephen King fanatics, and to those who do not ordinarily read Stephen King because they don't typically read horror stories. This book is a little bit of everything. It's a whodunit mystery. It's a historical fiction. It is biographical, in that many of the things written about Lee Harvey Oswald are indeed based on the research that Stephen King did about this man, this monster in our midst who changed the course of history on 11/22/63, which is a novel that I highly recommend to everybody. And that concludes this installment of Roy's Book Reviews. I hope you come back to hear my thoughts on other books as I push through with this project of love that I've embarked upon, and I'm enjoying myself so far. And I hope to hear from some of you in the comments, whether you've read this book or and agree with me or disagree with me, or perhaps I have convinced you to give it a shot. I would love to hear it. So let me know. Until then, happy reading.